He found her crying in the stables at midnight and never left her side. The lantern guttered when I pulled the door back, and the cold came in around my collar like somebody had laid a wet hand there. I'd come down near on midnight because the bay had been kicking the boards an hour, the way he did when weather was coming on or a cat was working the tree line, and I'd sooner lose the sleep than lose a horse to a panic in the dark. So I came down the path in my socks shoved into unlaced boots, the lantern swinging, cussing the bay under my breath. Got the door open and stood there a second, letting the light find the stalls. There was a horse in the end stall that wasn't mine. A claybank mare, head hung low, off hind cocked up so she was barely touching toe to the ground, and her sides going like a bellows standing still. Rode hard and then a good while past it. There was a rime of dried lather gone stiff and gray along her neck, one rein broke and dangling, and somebody had tied her to the post with a square knot, the kind a man ties who has never had a horse pull back and break his thumb. Nobody raised around stock ties a horse hard and square like that. And there was a sound coming out of the dark past her that I took for the mare at first, a thin wet catch of a sound, and then I knew it for what it was. It wasn't the mare. I have told this part more times in my own head than I have ever told it out loud, and every time it starts there with that knot. A square knot? I think on it still. A person can ride 40 miles in the dark with a child's bones aching and a man's name behind her like a dog, and the thing that tells you the most about her in the end is that she tied off the only thing she had left to a post the wrong way because she had never in her life had to learn the right one. There is more grief in that than in the crying. I knew it then, and I know it now. I lifted the lantern and came down the alley slow. She was sitting on the floor in the corner past the oat bin, her back to the boards, knees drawn up and her arms around them, and she had a man's coat over her too big in the shoulders, and she was looking up at the light with her chin set hard even while the rest of her was coming apart. There was hay on her like she'd tried to lie in it and couldn't. One hand was bleeding at the knuckles, gone dark and crusted. The other hand had a hold of something wrapped in oilcloth, and she wasn't about to let go of it for me or for God. I'm not a quick man with words. Never was. I stood there with the lantern and she looked at me, and what I said, and I have wished 100 times I'd had something better in me, what I said was, "That your mare." She wiped her face with the heel of the hand that wasn't bleeding fast like she was angry at it for being wet. "I'll pay for the stall," she said. "I didn't see a house with a light. I'll pay and I'll go on at first light." "You'll do neither one?" I said, and her chin came up another notch and her eyes went hard and ready, and I understood right then she had spent some part of recent days being told what she'd do by men, so I changed it. "I mean the mare's done. She goes on tonight, she won't go far and she won't go again. And you ride out at first light on a foundered horse, you'll be afoot by noon and a long way from anywhere." She looked at the mare. I'll give her this, even sitting there in the cold with her hand split open. The first thing she did when she heard the horse was done was she looked at the horse, not at herself. "Is it the leg?" she said. "Tendon maybe just spent. I'll know in the morning." She nodded once, and the chin came down a little, and I watched the fight go out of her shoulders the way water goes out of a trough you've kicked a hole in, all at once and quiet, and I thought she might pass right out on me there in the corner. I set the lantern on the bin. "Come up to the house," I said. "There's a stove, I won't ask you anything." "I have money," she said. "I didn't ask you for any." She got herself up off that floor on her own. I'll say that, too. I put a hand out and she looked at it like it was a snake, and I took it back, and she got up the long, slow way, one hand on the boards, the oilcloth bundle hugged in tight against her, and she came past me down the alley with her head up and stumbled at the door and caught the frame and went on. I have known plenty of proud men go down easier than that woman walked the 40 feet to my house with her hand bleeding, and her horse foundered, and nothing in the world that was hers any more but a wrapped-up bundle and the will to keep standing. Her name was Della. I didn't learn it till the next day. The mare didn't have one that she ever gave me. The bundle I came to know the whole shape of by and by, and there'll be time for it. I had better say what I was, up there, so you understand the size of what she'd ridden into. Up there meaning the bench above Burnt Fork, the long shelf of grass under the pass, where the wind has opinions and the snow comes early and stays late, and a man who chooses to live there alone is understood by the town below to be either running from something or fit for nothing, and they had decided some years back which one I was. I broke horses and I raised them and I sold them, and I did it well, and that part nobody argued. A horse I'd had my hands on 6 months would do for a green hand what a hard-mouthed one wouldn't do for a vaquero. But a man's work and a man's standing are two different sacks in this life, and they are not always packed the same. Down in Burnt Fork, I was the one they sent the boy up to fetch when the freighter's team went lame and nobody else could sort it. And I was also the one whose name they said a certain way in the mercantile, low with their chins when I'd paid and gone out. Quiet feller, keeps to himself up there. Wife and the little one are buried up there, you know. Something not right about a man stays up alone with that. There was a wife, Esther, and there was a girl, Ruth, who would have been near grown by the time of this telling, and was instead 3 years under a pine I cut the cross for myself. The two of them within a week of each other. The bad fever that came up the river the spring everything went wrong. I went down the mountain to fetch the doctor, and the doctor was 3 days drunk, and the road was washed, and I came back too late by a day and a night. And I will not say more about that than that, because it is not the part of this I'm telling, and because some things a man carries he doesn't unwrap for company. But you understand, by the time Della's mare's hooves hit my yard in the dark, I'd had 3 years of being a quiet feller who keeps to himself, and I'd come to believe it of myself the way you'll come to believe anything if the only voice saying it is the wind. I'd let my own worth go to seed. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't a man waiting on a chance to prove something. I was a man who'd stopped expecting to be of use to anybody but a horse. She slept 14 hours. I gave her the bed in the back, that being Esther's and mine, and unused near as long as the pine had its cross, and I cleaned the table off and built the fire up and sat in the chair with the rifle across my knees, not for her, for whatever had put a square knot in her and split her hand. Toward dawn I dozed and woke stiff with the fire low and went down to the barn. The mare was worse and better both. The leg was bowed, the tendon strained, no break in it. She'd come up sound in time if a body had the time to give her, and lame as a stove the whole while. I cold-soaked the leg in the trough and wrapped it and forked her hay and stood with her a bit. She leaned her head against my chest the way a horse will that's been pushed past asking, and is grateful to whoever finally lets it stop. Somebody had ridden that animal till it broke its own heart, and it hadn't been the woman in my house. You can read a horse the way some men read a Bible. This one had been spurred by hands that didn't know it was already giving everything it had. Della was up when I came back in. Standing at the stove with the coffee I'd left, the man's coat traded for one of Esther's shawls she'd found folded in the trunk, and I felt that somebody in Esther's shawl at Esther's stove felt it go through me cold, and then I let it go because what was I going to do, take the shawl off a freezing woman? "I'll wash that," she said, meaning the shawl, watching my face. "Keep it on," I said. "It's cold." She'd done up her hand with a strip off her own petticoat, neat, and she'd put her hair back, and in the daylight she was younger than the night had made her and harder both. Not pretty the way they put it on a poster. There was a strong, straight line to her jaw, and a way she had of looking at a thing direct, and a chip in one front tooth, and her eyes went over my house, my one room and the rifle and the cold side of the bed showing through the back door, and she added it up faster than I'd have liked and didn't say a word about it. "You said you wouldn't ask me anything," she said. "I won't. Then I'll tell you the only part you need." She set the cup down. Her hands were steady now. "My name is Della Voss. My husband Reuben is dead 5 weeks. His brother Hollis has decided the place we built is his, and the water with it, and that I'm something that comes with the place, like the well or the cook stove, and not a thing in this territory says otherwise except a deed Reuben filed in my name 3 days before he died, which is the deed his brother burned down half the house looking for." She put her wrapped hand flat on the oilcloth bundle on the table. "He didn't find it. I'll go on as soon as the mare can carry me, and you'll have a man named Hollis Voss come up your road asking after a woman on a claybank, and what you'll tell him is you saw her water a horse and ride north." I looked at her hand on the bundle. "How long since you ate?" I said. She blinked. It wasn't the question she'd braced for. "Day before yesterday." I made her eggs. 6 of them, all I had, and a slab of the side meat, and she ate it like a woman who decided she would not let me see how bad she needed it and could not quite manage the lie. She ate every bit and wiped the plate with bread, and I poured her more coffee and sat down across from her, and I said the thing I'd been turning over since the word brother. "Reuben fall sick," I said, "or did Hollis arrange it?" Her hand stopped on the cup. "Why would you ask me that?" "Because a man who'll burn his dead brother's house down looking for a paper isn't a man who waited around respectful for the dying to happen on its own. And because that mare in my barn was rode by somebody chasing you, not by you. You'd never spur a horse like that. So somebody nearly had you before you got loose of him on that animal." She was quiet a long time. The fire ticked. "His man," she said finally, "Caro, came near enough to lay a hand on the bridle last night, and the mare spooked off a rattler and put 40 feet between us, and I didn't look back. I just rode, and there was your barn." She looked at me straight. "Reuben fell off the high ditch breaking ice. That's the story. I held him 3 days. There was a place at the back of his head." She didn't finish it. She didn't have to. You ask hard questions for a man who promised not to ask any. "I lied," I said. "It's the only one I'll ask. I want to slow up here because the way the town would tell what came after, the way it got told down in Burnt Fork, by men who weren't there, is that I shot it out with the Voss outfit over a strange woman, and that's not it, that's not the size of it. There was hardly any shooting at all in the end. What there was a winter. She didn't ride north. The mare wasn't fit, and then it was fit and the first storm closed the pass, and then it was the kind of cold where a horse breathes frost and a body found froze on the trail is just the trails now till the thaw, and you don't put a woman out into that, and she knew you don't, and so we never had to have the argument about her staying. The snow had it for us. I slept in the barn. I want that plane too. I built a stall up into a sort of room with the spare tack and a buffalo robe and the little sheet iron stove I used for warming bits in the bad cold, and I slept down there with the horses and she had the house. And that's how it was that whole long winter, and any man hearing this who's grinning you can stop. It wasn't that, and it didn't get to be that for a long while, and when it did get to be something it came by the slow road, the only road worth the name. What it was that winter was work. She was no help, and then she was every help. First week she couldn't fork hay without it going down her sleeve, and by the deep of it she could halter the colts and not get run over, could read the bay's ears and step off out of his way before he ever swung, could hold a hoof for me while I trimmed, could doctor the claybank's leg better than I could because she had smaller hands and more patience for the soaking. She learned a horse the way she learned the right knot, fast and for keeps, because she'd decided to and because being able to do a thing for herself was the only ground she trusted to stand on. And in the evenings, with the wind laid over the cabin like a hand, she'd talk, not to be talked to set things down the way you set down a load you've carried too far. She told me about Reuben, who'd been a good man and a soft one, too soft for a brother like Holly's, a man who'd believe the best of his own blood right up till the ice in the back of his head. She told me about the place they'd built, the orchard he'd set out that wouldn't fruit for years he didn't get to have. She told me about the deed, why he'd filed it in her name because he'd known, near the end, what Holly's was, and a wife was the one thing a brother couldn't be next of kin to. She told me she'd had a child once, a boy, gone before his first winter, and she said it flat, the way you say a thing you've worn smooth, and I told her about the pine and the 2 crosses, and that was the only night either of us wept, her at the table and me at the door with my back to her so she could pretend not to see, and neither one of us said a word about the other one's grief, which is the only decent way to be in a room with somebody else's. I'll tell you when it turned for me, not when she got handsome to me, she'd been that since the eggs. It turned the night the roan colt got cast in his stall, down with his legs jammed under the boards and thrashing. The worst thing, a horse that'll break its own neck in 20 minutes of panic. And I was wrenched up bad in my back from the morning and couldn't get the leverage. And I hollered for her, and she came down through the snow in her nightdress and Esther's shawl and a pair of my boots, and she did not scream. She did not freeze. She got down in the muck and the flailing iron of those hooves and put her shoulder where I told her, and we rolled him, the 2 of us. Rolled 600 pounds of terror off his backside and got him up. And he came up shaking, and we stood there both of us shaking worse, plastered in filth. Her hair down and a hoof had caught her across the forearm and raised a welt the length of a hand. And she looked at the welt, and then she looked at me and she laughed. She laughed, down in the muck at 3 in the morning with a bruise rising on her arm and a wild colt blowing in the corner. That woman threw her head back and laughed like it was the finest thing that had happened to her in a year. And it likely was. And I stood there in my ruined barn in the cold and felt something in my chest I'd buried under a pine 3 years gone. Felt it move, like a creature you were sure had froze in the night turning over and drawing breath, and I thought, there it is. That's what I forgot I was, a man who could be of use to someone who'd laugh. I didn't say any of that. I said, get up to the house before you take a chill, and she said, yes, sir, mocking me, and went. And I stood in the dark a long while with my hand on the colt's neck, not for the colt. Hollies came in the false spring, the thaw that fools you, the week the road first opened. I'd known he was coming the way you know a storm. A man rode up the lower trail twice in the melting weeks and looked at the place from the timber and rode off. And I let him look. And I oiled the rifle and the old dragoon pistol that had been my father's, and I cut shooting lanes in my head between the barn and the house and the spring. Not because I wanted it, but because a man who's lived alone in high country learns to plan the ground before he needs it. And I told Della, and she went white, and then she went still, and the stillness was worse, and she said, "I'll go then, today. I won't bring it down on you." And I said no. I want to get this part right, because it's the whole of it. She said, "It isn't yours to fight. It isn't your land or your trouble or your—" And she stopped on the word, and I knew the word, and I let it sit. And she said, "You've given me a winter. That's more than I had any right to. I won't have you killed over a deed." And I came across the room, and I took the oilcloth bundle up off the shelf where it had lived all winter, and I put it in her 2 hands, and I closed her fingers over it, and I said, "This is yours. Reuben gave it to you because he knew his brother. You hold it." And I'll tell you something a horse taught me, since I'm not good at saying things. You can ride an animal till its heart breaks and it'll still try to carry you, because that's what it is, that's its nature, and a man like Hollies figures everything in the world is built that way, to be rode till it breaks and then left on the trail. He's never once in his life had a thing turn around and set its feet. I've spent 30 years setting horses' feet under them so they'd stop running. I'm not going to spend the rest of it running myself. She looked at me and her eyes filled, and she didn't let them spill, and she said low, "Why?" And I gave her the truth because I'd run dry of anything else. "Because you laughed in my barn," I said. And I'd forgot I was a man worth laughing near. They came the 3rd morning of the open road. 4 of them, Hollies in front on a tall black gelding too good for him, and a thin, pock-faced one I took for Caro, and 2 hired guns wearing town coats who sat their horses like the saddle owed them money. I was in the yard when they came up out of the timber, and I'd planned it that way, me in the open with the rifle in the crook of my arm muzzle down. Easy. And the house behind me with the door barred, and Della at the side window with the old dragoon, which she'd never fired, and which I'd shown her how to cock and where to point and nothing else, because the having of it mattered more than the using. Hollies pulled up 40 feet off and looked the place over the way men like him look at everything, pricing it. He was a heavy, handsome man going to fat, with his dead brother's chin and none of his brother's softness, and he smiled at me the way they smile. "You'd be the horse man," he said. "Heard you were up here, heard you might have come into some company this winter, a woman on a claybank mare." "There's a claybank in my barn," I said. "Came in lame in the fall, I bought her off a feller passing." "Did you?" He shifted in the saddle, and the 2 town coats fanned a little wider without being told, and I marked them both, the ground between them and me, the angle of the sun. "She have a name, this feller." "Didn't ask." Paid him $8, which was robbery, the shape she was in. Caro leaned and said something at Hollies' ear, and Hollies nodded, slow, still smiling, and he said, "Here's how it'll go, horseman. My brother's widow run off from her grief with property that belongs to my family, and she's somewhere in this country, and a man helping her hide is a man stealing from me same as she is. Now I don't want trouble with a feller minds his own horses. So you bring her out and the paper she carries, and you and me never had a word, and I'll even leave you the claybank for your $8. And if she's not here, then you'll stand aside while my men have a look in that barn and that house, and we'll all sleep easier knowing." I let it get quiet. A meadowlark went off somewhere up the bench, that liquid rising call, spring coming on regardless of us. I have thought since that the bird was the thing that decided it, that Hollies heard a bird and a quiet man and an empty yard, and let himself believe it was going to be easy. "No," I said. Just the one word. I'd practiced longer speeches in my head all winter, and when it came I had the one word and it was enough. Something went out of Hollies' face, not fear. Men like him don't fear a lone man in a yard, but a kind of surprise. The surprise the bridle-broke world hands a man the first time a thing he's reached for sets its feet. The 2 town coats felt it before he did. Their hands moved. I'll tell it the way it happened, and not the way the town tells it. I shot the near gun hand through the shoulder of his gun arm before his iron cleared, because I'd been shooting a rifle off a horse and off the ground in that exact yard for 15 years, and these men had been shooting at fence posts and frightened people, and there is all the difference in the world. The second one got his pistol up, and Della fired the dragoon through the side window, I learned after she'd shut her eyes when she did it, and the ball went God knows where, into the timber, into the sky. But the bark of it from a window they'd thought empty broke the morning, and his horse swapped ends under him, and he was busy living through that. Caro turned tail clean, just spun the black-eared bay he rode and lit out for the timber low over its neck. And I had the rifle's iron sights settled square on the third button of Holly's Voss's coat before his hand ever finished its reach, and he froze with it half drawn, and we held there, him and me, 40 feet of cold spring mud between us, for what felt like the better part of an hour and was maybe 4 seconds. "You can fill your hand," I told him, soft. "Or you can take your dogs and your shot man and go down my road and file in a court like a Christian and live. It's the only choosing you'll get from me, and you've got about as long as it takes me to lose my patience, which is short this morning." He looked at the muzzle. He looked past me at the window where the smoke was. And I watched the arithmetic happen behind that handsome going-to-fat face. The only arithmetic a man like him knows. The price of a thing weighed against the having of it. And I watched him decide that a deed and a woman weren't worth a hole through his third coat button. Because there is always, with men like Holly's, a price they won't pay, and the whole trick of them is making them name it. He let the pistol drop back. "This isn't done," he said. "It's done up here," I said. "You come back up my road, you won't go down it. That part's done." They went, the shot man slung over his own saddle moaning, the spooked one chasing his horse a foot a quarter mile down before he caught it, Holly's last, not looking back, his straight Voss back stiff as a post. I stood in the yard with the rifle until the timber took them and the meadowlark started up again, and then my hands began to shake, and I let them, since there was no one to see. Except there was. The door came off the bar behind me and she came out, and I turned, and she crossed that muddy yard fast, the dragoon still in her hand hanging down forgot at her side, and she didn't slow up and she didn't stop short the way she had at every threshold all winter, the way she'd looked at my offered hand that first night like a snake. She came straight on and she put her free hand flat on my chest, over the heart hard like she was checking the truth of something, like she had to feel for herself that the ball hadn't found me, and then she took a fistful of my coat and she leaned her forehead down against my chest where her hand had been, and she stood there. And I felt her shaking match up with my shaking, the two of us trembling in the cold sun, and I put my arms around her, careful. The way you gentle a colt that's been hurt by hands, and she didn't flinch off it. "You said no," she said, into my coat. Her voice was wrecked. "He stood right there, and you said no." "I did." She pulled back and looked up at me, and her eyes were streaming now, and she let them, finally, no more holding the line, and there was no fear left in her face at all, which was the thing I'd never once seen on it in all that winter, Della Voss with no fear in her face, just a fierce, wet, certain look, looking at me like I was solid ground. "Every man I ever knew," she said, "weighed me. Reuben weighed me kind and Holly's weighed me cruel, but they weighed me, what I was worth to keep or to take, and I rode 40 miles in the dark into a stranger's barn sure I'd be weighed again. And you fed me eggs and asked me one hard question and slept in the cold with the horses all winter, and you never once weighed me. You just—" she shook the fist she still had in my coat. "You just stood in the yard and said no." "Della," I said. "I'm not going north," she said. "I want that plain. The pass is open, and the road's clear, and I could ride out tomorrow on a sound mare with a winter's strength back in me and a deed in my hand. And I'm telling you to your face I'm not going to. And you'll have to be the one to send me off if you want me gone. Because I have done with running, and I have done with being sent. And the only place in this world I have wanted to stand since the night I tied my horse up wrong in your barn is right here, next to the man who didn't make me beg for it." And she stood there with her hand fisted in my coat and her feet set the way I'd taught 100 horses to set theirs so they'd stop being afraid. And I understood she was giving me a thing, freely, that no man takes. She was giving me the standing next to, the choosing. And it was hers to give, and she was giving it. And I have never in my life, before or since, been handed anything that weighed so much or cost me so little to be worthy of. I put my hand over the hand that was fisted in my coat. Her knuckles were healed by then, just a white seam where the split had been. I held her hand against me, and I said the only thing there was, which was, "Then you'd best learn to tie a proper knot, since you're staying around stock." And she laughed that same laugh, head back, the chipped tooth, laughed in the muddy yard with the powder smoke not gone out of the air yet. And I knew I was a man again, a whole one, because there was a good woman laughing at my poor joke with her feet set beside mine. And she wasn't going anywhere. And not one thing on this earth was going to make her, least of all me. We were married in Burnt Fork in June by a circuit preacher who didn't ask many questions, which suited us. The town came around, the way towns do. Once a thing is settled and there's nothing left to whisper about that, the whispering can change. The same men who'd said, "Quiet feller," keeps to himself, stood me to drinks at the wedding and told each other they'd always known there was more to me than I let on, which was a lie but a kind one, and I let them keep it. Holly's filed in the territorial court like I'd told him to, and lost, the deed being good and Reuben having been smarter dying than his brother gave him credit for, and the place and the orchard and the water passed to Della clean. We sold it. Neither of us wanted to live in a house Holly's had burned half down and a man had been killed for. We took the money and we bought the bench outright, the whole long shelf of grass under the pass, my barn and my horses and the 2 crosses under the pine. And Della planted an orchard of her own up there, apples, the high country kind that take the cold, and she said they wouldn't fruit for years and we likely wouldn't see much of it. And we said it not sad but easy, the way you can say a thing like that when you've stopped expecting to be cheated of your time. The Claybank mare came sound. Lived to 20-odd up on our grass and threw good colts, and Della never would sell one of her kept them all. Said the mare had brought her to the only place she'd ever stayed and was owed for it. And I didn't argue, never having won an argument with her about a horse or anything else. I am old now in the telling of this. The hands that broke the colts won't close all the way of a morning anymore, and Della's hair went gray a long time back, and she wears it the same, put up off her neck, and there is still a chip in that front tooth she will not let a dentist near. And the orchard fruited, after all, fruited for years we did get to have, and we have sat under those trees in the cool of more evenings than I can count. But the picture I keep, when I'm half asleep in the chair, and my mind goes back the way an old mind will, is not the wedding or the orchard or the long good years. It's the barn at night. It's me coming down in the dark to settle a horse, the lantern swinging, my breath gone to frost, and the door coming open, and a light already burning in the end stall where the little sheet-iron stove is going. And Della there ahead of me in her coat with a foaling mare, her sleeves shoved up and her gray hair coming down, looking back over her shoulder at me coming through the door, not crying, not anymore, not for 40 years, just looking back at me with that direct, fierce, easy look, glad I've come. Having known I would, the 2 of us about to stand the long night through together with the animals, the way we always have, the way I'd have given anything to know I would. Back when I was the quiet feller who'd buried his worth under a pine, and figured no one would ever come up the dark road and find it. She found me there. That's the part the town never got right. She's the one who came in out of the cold and found me.